Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the voting laws of colonial India. And let me tell you, this system wasn't just restrictive. It was practically a masterclass in exclusion, engineered to keep almost everybody away from the ballot box.
So let's kick things off with a real head-scratcher. If the laws never actually said you can't vote because of your caste, or you can't vote because you're a woman, then how on earth did they manage to create one of the most exclusive voting systems in the world? How do you build these massive walls without ever even mentioning them?
All right, let's get into it. The secret is in this system of invisible filters. It turns out what the law didn't say was maybe even more powerful than what it did. All right, Section 1, a system of exclusion. We're looking at how Britain designed a so-called loyal electorate. You see, the British strategy was pretty simple, really. For them, voting wasn't a universal right. No, it was a privilege. And it was a privilege they only gave to a very specific, hand-picked group of people they knew they could count on. This was never about building a democracy. It was all about holding on to power.
So the first real glimpse of voting rights comes with something called the Indian Councils Act of 1892. But just look at who actually got a seat at the table. We're talking about the big landowners, the zamindars, we're talking about people paying some serious taxes, and a tiny slice of educated elites like graduates and lawyers. This wasn't exactly a crowd, it was more like the very, very tip of the iceberg.
Which of course brings us to the big question, why them? Why these specific groups? What was so special about owning land, paying a lot in taxes, or having a degree? Well, the answer to that, it basically unlocks the entire colonial playbook. It all came down to this. The British wanted to create a small, loyal, and totally manageable group of voters. Think about it. The landowners, they often owed their position to the colonial system. The wealthy, they were benefiting from it. The educated elites, they were molded by it. The British figured these guys would be natural allies. They were meant to be a kind of buffer against the rising tide of nationalism, a small, reliable class that definitely was not going to rock the boat. Okay, next up, the invisible caste filter, or how neutral rules became a massive caste barrier. And this is where it gets really clever, in a pretty sinister way. The key thing to grasp is how these rules, which look totally neutral on the surface, right? Just about money and education, how they actually worked as a powerful, almost perfect filter for caste, without ever once saying the word caste.
The logic was, it was devastatingly simple. Here's how it worked. Step 1, you tie voting rights directly to things like wealth, land, and education. Step 2, you do this in a society where, for centuries, upper castes had held a virtual monopoly on all of those things. So what's the result? Step 3, the lower castes are automatically shut out. No need to name them, the system does all the work for you. It's exclusion by design, all under the cover of supposedly neutral rules. And this chart really lays out the practical result. You want to vote? You need to own land. Well, guess who owned most of the land? Upper castes like Brahmins and Rajputs. You need to pay high taxes? Again, that's the wealthy merchants and elites, mostly from the same social groups. And education? That was a privilege that was systematically denied to Dalits and other marginalized communities. The endgame? Politics became a closed club, almost exclusively for upper caste men. So let's talk about the next section, the double burden of gender, and why women were left completely outside the system. Because if that caste filter was one giant wall, there was another, equally high wall standing right behind it. For women, the barriers to even get close to a ballot box were, they were even higher. And just like the caste filter, the law never had to say, no women allowed. The system was already set up to do that. First, you have a deeply patriarchal society where public life, politics, that's all seen as a man's domain. But here's the kicker, property rights. Most women couldn't own land or have their own income, so how could they possibly meet the landowning or tax-paying qualifications? They couldn't. And on top of that, access to education was incredibly limited for women. It's the same pattern. You put up these economic and educational barriers, and women are just systematically locked out. But what about women from lower caste communities? Well, for them, it was a crushing double disadvantage. Think about it. They were blocked by the gender barrier and by the caste barrier. They were facing two massive systems of exclusion at the same time. For them, political participation wasn't just difficult, it was pretty much impossible.
But a system like this, no matter how carefully designed, was never going to last forever without a fight. And that brings us to our next section, challenging the system. Because voices of change did start to rise, and they began demanding a completely new vision for India.
One of the key turning points came in 1917. A delegation, led by the incredible Sarojini Naidu, went straight to the British government and made the first official political demand for women's right to vote in India. Their argument was powerful and simple. You can't talk about freedom for India if you don't also talk about freedom and equality for Indian women.
And you have to understand, this fight for inclusion was happening on two major fronts at once. On one hand, you had the national movement, with leaders like Sarojini Naidu pushing for things like universal women's suffrage. But at the same time, you had these incredibly powerful regional movements, especially in South India with groups like the Justice Party, who are attacking the entire upper caste monopoly on power head-on.
So let's talk about the Justice Party's big idea, something called communal representation. Now, that term might sound divisive, but for them, it was all about inclusion. They successfully pushed for reserved seats in government councils and in jobs for non-Brahmins, Muslims, and other communities. What they were doing was directly challenging that old idea that only the upper castes were fit to rule. They were fundamentally breaking that monopoly.
Okay, and all of these different struggles, they all came together and led to something huge, a new era of equality. This was India's revolutionary leap forward after independence.
To really get a sense of how massive this change was, you just have to look at the numbers. Under the British, at the absolute peak in 1935, only about 10 to 14% of the population could vote. That's it. Almost everyone else was still completely shut out of the system.
And then, 1950, the new constitution. India didn't just tweak the rules, it took this incredible leap. 100% of adult citizens got the right to vote. Not gradually. Overnight. Every single adult. Just like that.
This was a complete 180-degree turn, championed by leaders like B.R. Ambedkar and Jawaharlal Nehru. It was a total rejection of that old colonial model. You can see the difference right here. The colonial system, voting was a privilege. The new Indian constitution, voting is a right. The old system was based on exclusion, property, taxes, education. The new one, based on inclusion, equality for all. It was a shift from a system designed for control to one designed for social justice.
And this new way of thinking didn't just stop at the ballot box. It pushed into economic rights too. And here, the state of Tamil Nadu was a real pioneer. Inspired by the social justice ideas of leaders like Periyar, they passed a landmark law way back in 1989. It gave daughters equal rights to ancestral property. This was absolutely revolutionary for its time, and it took another 16 years for the central government to extend similar rights across the whole country.
So, as we wrap this up, India's history really leaves us with a huge question, one that's still relevant today. The country's leap to universal suffrage was a powerful rejection of its colonial past. But it also teaches us that real democracy isn't just about what's written down in a constitution. It's about constantly looking for and tearing down those invisible filters, the economic, social, or educational barriers that can still silence people. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? What are the invisible walls that might still exist in our democracies today?